Good afternoon. This hearing is called to order. Welcome to all the witnesses. Thank you for being here. Today's hearing is the second in a series of hearings focused on the future of the International Space Station. During the previous hearing, this subcommittee received testimony from government witnesses who cast considerable doubt on the administration's proposal to end federal support of the International Space Station in 2025. In our hearing, not only did NASA confirm that the International Space Station has operational life through at least 2028, if not longer, but NASA's Inspector General raised significant concerns that it is not only quite unlikely that a private entity or entities would assume the station's annual operating costs, but also, quote, any assumption that ending direct federal funding would free up $3 billion to $4 billion in 2025 for use on other NASA initiatives is wishful thinking. I agree with the concerns that NASA's Inspector General has raised to this subcommittee. The concerns and the confirmation from NASA that the ISS has operational life well beyond 2025 should not be taken lightly by members of this committee or by the National Space Council. American taxpayers have invested roughly $100 billion in the International Space Station, and it is my firm belief that it would be irresponsible for the United States government to prematurely end the life of the International Space Station before maximizing American taxpayer investment. We should not throw away that very significant investment of resources from the taxpayers and also from our allies. It is concerning that some have argued during this debate that the rationale for ending direct funding of the ISS is that the United States cannot afford both continued ISS operations and deep space exploration at the same time. I disagree that this is an either-or decision. And Congress has demonstrated a strong bipartisan commitment to NASA and to our human spaceflight programs through significant increases in appropriations over the last several fiscal years to ensure both a healthy low Earth orbit and deep space exploration program. What's clear is we cannot afford to continue to pursue policies that have the consequences of creating gaps in capability, or that send $3.5 billion in taxpayer money to the Russian government because we failed to plan to have adequate tools to reach low Earth orbit. Nor can we create a leadership vacuum in low Earth orbit that provides a window of opportunity for the Chinese to capitalize upon as they look to have an operational space station in low Earth orbit in 2022. As long as I am chairman of the Space Subcommittee, the ISS will continue to have strong and bipartisan support in the United States Senate. In the past several years, we've passed two major pieces of space legislation working cooperatively, Republicans and Democrats, in support of space. One that was signed by President Obama, one that was signed by President Trump. The purpose of today's hearing is to receive testimony from non-governmental ISS stakeholders who can provide Congress with their first-hand experience interacting with the ISS and what the impact would be for commercial stakeholders, even those looking at building a successor to the ISS, which we will need one day, but we should not prematurely disregard the investment we have made into it. I look forward to our witnesses' testimony and will now recognize our subcommittee's ranking member, Senator Markey, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Today, a trio of astronauts from the United States, Russia, and Europe blasted off for the International Space Station. But if the Trump administration has its way, in just a few short years, that sort of mission might not be possible. The International Space Station is the lone platform in low Earth orbit on which our astronauts can undertake fundamental research for humankind's health, well-being, and prosperity in space. We continue to push deeper into our solar system, but the space station remains of paramount importance. Construction of the space station began in 1998 in cooperation with the Russian, Canadian, European, and Japanese space industries. Continuously occupied for almost 2 decades, the scientific research executed on board the space station has given us unique insights from many stakeholders and produced countless valuable results. Because of the International Space Station, we better understand the basic physics of our planet, have developed antimicrobial vaccines, and are improving cancer-fighting drugs. Yet, in February, the Trump administration announced that it would end direct funding to the International Space Station after 2024, turning it into a privately run entity. Although many stakeholders have voiced support for a long-term transition to a privately run space station, they are fearful of the lights going out as a result of the Trump administration's proposal. We simply cannot pull the plug on the International Space Station without a plan in place for what comes next. As we work to put humankind back on the moon and onto the Martian surface for the first time, as well as to open up new commercial and telecommunications opportunities in space, it is crucial to understand the many dangers which we face. The International Space Station is the only platform in existence on which we can research how the harsh conditions of space affect the human body and mind. In fact, NASA has declared that an on-orbit platform like the space station is absolutely necessary to research the impacts of the majority of risks to human health that exist as we venture deeper into space. If we really want to go where no one has gone before, we need the International Space Station to not go away. Outstanding universities like MIT, the University of Florida, Texas A&M, in partnership with the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health, and companies across the nation are all undertaking fundamental scientific research through the Center for the Advancement of Science in Space. This research can only be done in a microgravity environment like the International Space Station. Putting an end to direct funding for the space station after 2024 would seriously interrupt, if not completely end, the scientific research that is critical for building a commercial market in space. It would spell serious trouble for both NASA and the commercial space industry. We cannot afford to allow funding for the space station to crater in 2025. What we need is a nuanced transition plan for the next great space age that carefully reflects the commercial market and the space community's needs. But that is not what this administration has put forward. The International Space Station is an irreplaceable facility for science and human exploration in space. It is an interplanetary incubator, fostering discovery, focusing imagination, and supporting achievement. It builds goodwill and good discoveries at the same time. I look forward to continuing to work with the chairman and my colleagues, led by Senator Nelson, on a bipartisan basis to ensure that the International Space Station can continue to house the research that inspires the world and promotes progress. And we thank the witnesses for being here, and we look forward to your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Markey. Would now like to recognize Senator Nelson, the ranking member of the full committee, if he would care to make an opening statement.
Thank you. And just to undergird the remarks already made by the chairman and the ranking member of the subcommittee, I might note that this November marks 20 years since the Russians launched the Zara module, and then NASA launched the Unity module 2 weeks later, and so began the assembly of the International Space Station. And now we're on a new age, golden age, for this incredible structure in space, the ISS, because Boeing and SpaceX are set to begin launching crew from the Cape. That's going to allow us to increase the number of astronauts aboard the station and dramatically increase the amount of research. And of course, all of NASA's centers have come together. The astronauts trained at Johnson, the launched at Kennedy, the experiments prepared and assembled in final form at Kennedy, and now the ISS is performing well, and it ought to keep going to 2030, because now's the time to reap the benefits of all the effort and all the expense that we have to build the ISS, and now let's do the research on it. And there's a broad bipartisan consensus to keep it going and not to have this arbitrary date that's going to cut off after 2024. Why in the world would you want to take a large multi-year investment of $100 billion and suddenly deorbit it and let it burn up on reentry? What about the commercial crew and the cargo capabilities that we've been investing so heavily in? What would happen to them if there's no certainty that they're going to have a destination, even though we have other space stations that are in the planning stage? I can tell you one group of people that understand this, and that's the Chinese. It's no accident that within a few months of the administration's proposal to end the space station in 2025, the Chinese announced that their space station will soon be open for business. And just last week, they invited countries from around the world to conduct research aboard their space station. And they advertise a lot of capabilities: medical sample analysis, combustion science, freezers, a science glove box, very similar to what we have on the ISS. So at one point in the future, we may have low Earth orbit filled with commercial space stations serving NASA and other government and private sector customers. And then NASA is going to be doing what it needs to do, which is get out beyond low Earth orbit and explore the heavens. But the ISS is not an obstacle to that. It can be complementary. And so thank you all for holding this hearing. I appreciate it very much. We're very fortunate to have a panel of experts as we do today. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. And I'll make a point to observers that one of the things that I think is striking across the opening statements, there are many issues on which Senator Markey, Senator Nelson, and I might disagree. But when you have unanimity across the partisan spectrum, across the ideological spectrum, when you're hearing the exact same thing from conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats, that the ISS...
Moderate Democrats. Moderate Democrats.
I will let folks self-identify as they choose. I didn't say nutcase lefties. I kept it. Everyone can self-identify on that spectrum, and even our are friendly libertarians in Colorado. I mean, we've got a full spectrum, and yet what there's agreement across that spectrum is that the ISS is a critical asset to the United States of America. It is a tremendous asset for scientific research, for innovation, for discovery. The American taxpayers have invested $100 billion into it. Our allies have invested billions and billions of dollars into it. And it would be foolish to waste that investment, to cut it short, to invent an arbitrary deadline like 2025 and say, never mind that we have additional good productive use out of it, we're going to plunge our head into the sand and throw away that asset. That is the height of foolishness, and this is a message that should be heard. It should be heard by every contractor, everyone doing business with the ISS, by every researcher who has an idea for a new innovation on the ISS, and by our allies, our partners in the ISS, that whatever might be put in an OMB proposal, it remains the Congress of the United States that authorizes programs and that appropriates programs. And when you see bipartisan unanimity in support of the ISS, the position of the United States government should be clear and unambiguous. And part of the reason why you see that unanimity is because of what we're hearing from the leaders at NASA, from the stakeholders about the science and the potential future. And this panel is an excellent representation of those with deep expertise and knowledge. And so with that, I'm going to introduce each of the four witnesses. Mr. Michael Suffredini is the president and CEO of Axiom Space. Axiom plans to launch 2 commercial modules in 2021, setting the stage for the first commercial space station in low Earth orbit. Prior to Axiom, Mr. Suffredini served for 10 years at NASA as the manager of the International Space Station. In that role, Mr. Suffredini spearheaded the transition of ISS from development and assembly to research and commercial utilization. He managed a 15-nation team and a $3 billion budget, which was the largest international peacetime project in the history of humanity. Mr. Bob Mitchell, a longtime friend, is the president of the Bay Area Houston Economic Partnership. He has served in this role since 2008. When he first joined the partnership in 2000, Mr. Mitchell oversaw the statewide implementation of the State Space Alliance Technology Outreach Program. Prior to that, Mr. Mitchell gained extensive experience during his 15 years at Grumman Aerospace Corporation, now known as Northrop Grumman. As an executive at Grumman, Mr. Mitchell directed all production, engineering, and material operations for the Houston facility. Mr. Jim Chilton is Senior Vice President of the Space and Launch Division of Boeing Defense, Space, and Security. His portfolio includes the International Space Station, the CST-100 Starliner commercial crew vehicle, NASA's Space Launch System, government and commercial satellite systems, and Boeing's participation in United Launch Alliance. Previously, Mr. Chilton served as Vice President and Program Manager for Exploration Launch Systems and led SLS, Boeing's heavy lift launch vehicle program. And finally, Ms. Cynthia Bouthot, who is Director of the Commercial Innovation and Sponsored Programs at the Center for the Advancement of Science and Space, also known as CASIS. Ms. Bouthot heads a team of business development professionals that focus on generating flight projects for the ISS National Lab in the life science, energy, chemicals, materials, clean tech, and IT sectors. Prior to her current position, Ms. Bouthot was president of the Collaborative Innovation Group, an organization focused on providing the tools and methodologies to establish successful product offerings, developing efficient routes to market, and building image and brand. And with that, we'll start the testimony. We'll begin with you, Mr. Suffredini.
Ranking Member Nelson, Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Markey, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to give my perspective on the future of the International Space Station and specifically the transition to a vibrant, robust marketplace in low Earth orbit. From 2005 to 2015, as NASA's ISS program manager, I oversaw development, assembly, operation, and utilization of the International Space Station for the United States government and the 14 other countries who participate in the program. I retired after 27 years of government service and later co-founded Axiom Space, whose goal is to build, launch, and operate the world's first commercial space station. With decades of engineering, operations, and management experience in human spaceflight, we are uniquely equipped to take the baton from the remarkably successful ISS to continue its legacy in LEO and facilitate the extension of America's leadership among spacefaring nations. But the handoff must be accomplished carefully. I see several key elements of a successful transition strategy. First, as NASA begins its human spaceflight focus and budget, from LEO to deeper space exploration, one concept must remain inviolable. The United States must not relinquish uninterrupted access to LEO for its astronauts. I have detailed in my written testimony the work that is either underway or planned for the ISS that will need to be continued indefinitely in LEO to support sustained human deep space exploration. But as important as those activities are, the principal argument for the U.S. to maintain uninterrupted access to and a destination in LEO is intangible, to safeguard our position as the world's preeminent spacefaring nation. We hold that position today thanks in no small part to our leadership of the ISS partnership, but other countries like Russia, China, and even Europe are taking leadership steps in the absence of a strong American commitment to exploration, and the end of the ISS represents an opportunity for them to fill a void. Sending astronauts to a LEO platform will always appeal to nation-states. It is therefore imperative that there be no gap in access between the platform of today, the ISS, and its American commercial successor. Second, NASA must allow companies to compete for the right to attach one or more modules to the ISS as soon as possible. While it's certainly possible to develop and launch a free-flying commercial space station, there are numerous advantages both for the commercial provider and the government to starting one or more modules mated to a port on the ISS. These advantages are also outlined in my written testimony. A NASA request for information in the summer of 2016 solicited information on the commercialization of LEO, the potential business case, and the criteria to grant access to an ISS port. This RFI was intended to inform a follow-on announcement opportunity which itself would result in granting access to an ISS port to a commercial entity. Now, almost 2 years later, a NASA research announcement was released soliciting proposals to study commercialization of LEO. These studies are not due until the end of the calendar year. If the resultant studies are used only to inform a competitive port award process, it is unlikely that access to a port will be granted before 2020. The award of a berthing port is the first domino that must fall in a chain of events, each of which relying on the previous, that will lead to a viable commercial platform in LEO and confidence that the nation is ready to transition its human LEO activities from ISS to commercial operators. Therefore, NASA should announce a fair and open competition for the right to use an ISS berthing port in parallel with, rather than following, the NRA studies. Finally, the FY 2019 President's budget includes $150 million for LEO commercial development. As the head of a commercial space station company you might reasonably expect, I would like to receive some of that money to put toward module development. I do not. These resources should be utilized to foster increased LEO demand. To award contracts for development of hardware is to put NASA funding and its extensive development requirements in the critical path for success and threatens to hold the agency hostage in the event the awardee would need more money to complete their design. NASA should give priority to companies who raise their own capital. These firms will be incentivized to help grow LEO demand beyond merely the government customer. Their survival will depend on it. The only way for NASA to eventually divert much of the almost $3.5 billion that it's spending today on ISS to deep space exploration is by not owning a LEO infrastructure or becoming an anchor tenant. A truly commercial platform will succeed only if it has multiple customers, both private and government. Public-private partnership in this case work best when the public promotes expansion of the demand and the private spends its own capital to satisfy it. In summary, we cannot afford for the transition in the United States' human presence in LEO from the ISS to one or more U.S. commercial platforms to be unsuccessful. Ensuring continued access to a LEO platform for our astronauts will maintain our position as the world's leading spacefaring nation. To achieve this in a manner that will allow the most timely transition, NASA must issue an opportunity for companies to compete for the ISS support as soon as possible. Finally, any funding made available to NASA to help develop commercial capability in LEO should be spent on building demand. I look forward to answering questions.
Thank you. Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Nelson, and Ranking Member Markey. Thank you for the opportunity today to be here to testify on an important topic is the International Space Station. I serve as the president of the Bay Area Houston Economic Partnership, a member-driven 501c6 nonprofit economic development organization located just outside the gates of the Johnson Space Center. We have over 268 members, which include a diverse mix of businesses in aerospace, medical, life sciences, petrochemicals, and maritime. We also are proud to work on initiatives that contribute to the economic growth of the 13 cities and 2 counties in and around the Johnson Space Center. Although aerospace companies make up a fraction of our membership, the entire business community understands and values the contributions of NASA and the space community in making all of our lives better. The ISS is a critical element of the work performed at Houston at the Johnson Space Center and the backbone to maintaining a number of key elements of our success in human spaceflight. The astronaut corps, mission control, countless technical resources, and world-class researchers. The Johnson Space Center offers unparalleled national capability that has been built over decades of experience. The loss of or weakening of its capabilities would have dramatic implications to our outcomes in deep space exploration. The return on investment of the ISS can be calculated in many ways. It's difficult to quantify the exact dollar value of many of these returns, but the overall impact is undeniable. The International Space Station, by its design and enactment has established the foundation for sustained generation of technology that improves life on Earth. Each year, spin-offs like new drugs, materials, scientific technology become licensed and begin generating new revenue streams for companies large and small. Beyond the ability to show the ROI, ISS positions us to tackle the challenge of deep space by buying down cost and risk now to give missions to the Moon and Mars a head start. The station is a critical, inexpensive test bed for exploration and hardware that needs to work perfectly on its first live mission. It allows us to test, tweak, and perfect life support systems, radiation abatement methods, and other advanced materials. These breakthroughs will eventually make it from launch pad into our homes and businesses across America. Through engagement with the Russian Space Agency and 13 other ISS partners, the U.S. has led an era of peaceful collaboration and exploration that has provided stability in space, leading to the current level of space commercialization. The commitment to the ISS, uninterrupted for the last 25 years, has provided more than just a destination to space. The ISS has cultivated a cultural learning lab for diplomacy, education, and inspiration, a learning lab for technology applications, testing performance machines, materials, and humans in space, a science lab for comparing terrestrial knowledge in a new frontier in weightlessness, a lab for exploring both on Earth and outer space in preparation for the next exploration endeavors. I think it's important to take a detailed look at the overall ISS budget, which is often cited at around $3.5 to $4 billion per year. What is misleading about this statement is that the commercial crew and cargo programs are funded out of those funds, along with overhead costs at the centers housing the programs. The real ISS budget is a fraction of that total cost, ranging from $1 to $1.5 billion per year. Saving this much each year will have minimal impact on overall exploration efforts in terms of funds transfer. Commercial alternatives would likely cost significantly more than sustaining the ISS, essentially creating an entirely new development program while providing a fraction of the existing capabilities. If the U.S. government terminates its support of the ISS in 2025 and we step away from the ISS before an equivalent long-term engagement is created, there will be a disruption in the space program and an emerging commercial space industry. Not very long ago, NASA's Constellation program was canceled. At the same time, we retired the Space Shuttle program, which profoundly had a negative impact on America's leadership in space. I sincerely hope that we all learned a valuable lesson from this and trust that you will not allow history to repeat itself. My position is that the U.S. government should commit to the ISS for as long as it is safely feasible to do so. However, as we succeed, others look to follow. As you probably have seen, just last week, China invited other nations to partner with them on their space station. They realize, as we do, the power of these partnerships and the leadership and the technology that can be gained from them. As we question our commitment to the future of the ISS, the Chinese space program is actively seeking to leverage this moment in time to provide an alternative path and platform for our traditional international space partners. This has very serious implications for our national security, trade, technology partnerships, and leadership if this is not managed carefully. At the end of the day, the ISS program is the culmination of all the reasons we are so passionate about the entire space program. It represents America's future in global leaderships, education, innovation, healthcare, and the quality of life. Thank you for the invitation to speak on this topic, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Chilton.
Thank you, Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Nelson, Ranking Member Markey. I'm very grateful for the chance to speak here and also for your leadership over a long period on space. I'm here representing Boeing, and with great pride, as I was once Mike Suffredini's contractor, building and supporting a space station. Something I'd like to point out that's been said is humans have been living on orbit for 18 years, which means that today's high school students, the kids graduating this month, have never had a day in school without people living and working aloft. And I support all previous witnesses and the senators who have said we ought to keep permanent human presence in low Earth orbit and humanity, for all of humanity. Let me talk about Boeing's role. We were the prime system developer of the station from the U.S. operating segment standpoint, and that meant we integrated all the international partners as well, because that was fundamentally an American-led enterprise. That means we created a bunch of industrial relationships with international partners. That was good for American business, and I think it set a new model. It does put us in a role to opine about ISS longevity. Some of you may know that we recently conducted a study for NASA and concluded, with NASA's approval, that the ISS could live structurally through 2028. I'd like to point out that it's not unusual for a Boeing product to go a lot longer than her initial design life. Think about B-52s, where the grandsons and daughters of the original pilots are now flying them. They're actually better airplanes than they were before, and today the space station is a better vehicle than when the first modules were hooked together. But the question of longevity is very important for anyone who wants to close a business case. Think about buying an airplane where the airworthiness certificate expires in 3 years. So it will be important for people to develop opinions with facts and data around the long-term life of the station. Ours is that the mid-2030s are eminently reasonable, given the history of our product lines. Given that, if we assume that, let me talk about a first-order commercial assessment as an industrial partner to NASA. The U.S. operating segment costs the U.S. government about $3.2 billion a year. These numbers are approximate. $1.8 billion, that over half, is launch for resupply. $1.1 billion approximately is ops and sustaining. That's keeping the lights on. Boeing addresses about half of that market, a little less than half. And by the way, our cost of doing the same work has come down about 30% in 10 years. So there has been progress in partnership with NASA. $300 million of this is the research and science money, which my colleague and fellow witness will address. But if you add all that up, our assessment is the U.S. operating segment is funded by the government at about $3.2 billion a year, and there's about $100 million of revenue that we've now been able to get across all parties on space station, and that's a big gap. So just as an industrialist, please consider that some incremental capability-based approach may make more market sense than absolutely cutting it on a date. There are global, well, let me add one more thing. Historically, none of the people who generate revenue on the station today pay for launch, raising questions like, does the commercial entity, if this ever happened, if one commercial entity operated the station, do they control the launchers, or does the government continue to provide those? I offer that question because there are many things to be considered as we go forward. But the difference between $3.2 billion and $100 million is a lot commercially. That's a big gap. Global considerations have been mentioned, but I would argue that ISS paved the way for true interdependency on space projects. It is a false choice, in my view, that you have to choose between going further into deep space and staying in low Earth orbit. We wouldn't know how to go further into deep space if we hadn't learned how to build the space station. And if you believe that humanity is best served doing something collaboratively with other nations for deep space, ISS is our only model. So we should consider that government funding in the U.S. is something that other nations look at. Their governments will continue to fund their segments. Capital in their countries doesn't flow in the same way that it flows in our country, in the way Mr. Suffredini has referenced. So we should all be mindful that we have to harmonize that operating model if we would like to retain the option to have international partners under our leadership for deep space. So we shouldn't fall for the choice of station or BO. We need station to prove out BO, not just technically, but as an operating model across industry and governments. So I'll leave you with, you now know our view that LEO and deeper space are compatible, and we shouldn't be lulled into anyone trying to choose that we must do only one or the other. So I would offer that a recommendation, to use your authorities and powers, that we should avoid uncertainty for the science community. Some of these long cycle science projects take 6 to 8 years lead time. If they believe, if those researchers who currently haven't been paying, some pay, some don't, believe that they might get a bill, or they believe that the model won't be sound, we could see science dry up soon, this year, next year, people on these long cycle experiments. And we should be mindful to signal certainty and incrementalism. We should be very careful to, whatever we do, keep a permanent human space, human presence in space. We have had times in the U.S. where we couldn't get access to space between Apollo and Shuttle, and we're going through one now between Shuttle. Let's not, I respectfully suggest we try not to do that with our presence in low Earth orbit. And so when I wrap all that up, the uncertainty could be around just picking a time and say everything must change by 1 year. A more incremental capabilities-based approach seems more appropriate from Boeing's perspective. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Mr. Chilton. Ms. Bouthot.
Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Markey, Ranking Member Nelson, thank you for the opportunity to share with you my views on the International Space Station. Today I plan on discussing the success we've achieved in driving new demand for the ISS National Lab. CASIS is the manager of the National Lab and is serving as a bridge from a government-driven operation to a commercially sustainable marketplace. In this short time, I will describe why demand is important to a sustainable LEO marketplace. What is the state of that demand, and how have we been able to build it? And basically, why we need more time. An end date was suggested for the ISS National Lab that would fully commercialize operations by 2025. We understand that commercialization is imminent, and we are fully supporting this process. However, to achieve this goal, enough time must be given both for a smooth transition and for the nation to realize the return on investment to the American taxpayer. So let me start with why is building demand important. It's the foundation for a sustainable and self-funded LEO marketplace. It's the source of revenue for the transportation, on-orbit providers, and services market, some of my colleagues here on the panel. Demand is providing a tangible return on investment to the American taxpayer. And finally, the demand we're generating right now with research and development is the underpinning for eventual manufacturing in space. So what is the state of this demand? Today, more than 55% of our payloads are commercial customers and include large programs from iconic Fortune 500 companies, as well as innovative startups. We have flown more than 175 payloads and have 88 in queue. A majority are new to space, and 20% are repeat users. Work on the ISS is providing tangible return on investment to the American taxpayer. We have looked at a value impact process where our project sponsors, validated by external experts, project incremental revenue of more than $900 million, a total addressable market of $110 billion, an acceleration in time to market on average of 1.5 years, and thousands of new direct and indirect jobs. These are just a few of the economic metrics tied directly to the projects executed on the International Space Station National Lab. Some examples of these projects are Houston Methodist Research Institute working with Novartis in Cambridge on an implantable drug delivery system for muscle atrophy, Nalco Champion, an Ecolab company in Sugar Land, working on biofilms related to corrosions in piping, and Honeywell out of Clearwater, Florida, looking at remote sensing applications to detect oil and gas leaks in remote parts of the world. So let's step back, and how are we able to build this demand? CASIS has funding of $15 million per year from NASA, which does not allow us to act like a big funding agency like the NIH. Therefore, we had to find creative ways to build demand, which admittedly has not been easy. When we first stood up CASIS, there were no customers banging down our doors, and there was generally a lack of awareness of the ISS. In my testimony, I describe over the past 6 years what we did to actually build this demand and how we evolved from an organization that initially had to pay researchers, who were mostly academic, to an organization that attracts commercial companies that are paying their way. To date, over $140 million of skin in the game, which is non-CASIS, non-NASA funding, has directly paid for flight projects. This excludes transportation cost. And this trend is increasing as more and more commercial companies are seeing the value of space-based research. Per our cooperative agreement with NASA, CASIS cannot accept royalties or fees for services. So we had to be creative when attempting to generate additional non-NASA funding to support new demand. We created a sponsored program model that has generated over $33 million of committed third-party funding for X-Prize type competitions like Target's $1 million Cotton Sustainability Challenge and our partnership with Boeing on the Mass Challenge Accelerator and Genes in Space STEM program. So finally, why do we need more time? First of all, we believe the perceived cliff with a hard cutoff date of 2025 or unknown path forward dampens long-term prospects for demand. Companies will simply stop investing if they don't see a runway that matches their R&D roadmap. Secondly, any abrupt change in which the private sector is asked to assume the role of managing the ISS without its best and most profitable uses defined may stunt the return on the investment to the American taxpayer. And finally, the demand I've just described is nascent and growing, and it's also on a trajectory to manufacturing in space. Two big examples are advanced materials, which could revolutionize the communications and semiconductors industry. The second example is the regenerative medicine work we're doing, which could ultimately lead to manufacturing new organs like heart and lung in space. In conclusion, we are creating demand. We have a model that's working. We see a trajectory to a sustainable marketplace, but we need time to ensure a smooth transition and to fully realize the benefits and fulfill this vital mission. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bouthot. Let's start with questioning Mr. Chilton. Based on the technical study and the report that Boeing produced for NASA on the lifespan of the International Space Station, what's your assessment of the real lifespan of the station, and how can we fully leverage this investment to get the maximum return on the platform?
Our assessment of lifespan of station with all the calculations complete is to 2028. In the course of doing that, we saw no technical showstoppers to extend her life significantly. I mentioned previously the 2030s seem very reasonable. I'd like to point out that as we've improved in partnership with NASA the capability of the station, I mentioned it's a better platform today than 10 years ago. The natural upgrade and improvement process in the course of maintenance should take all the subsystems that are not structured just as reasonably.
So from a scientific and technical perspective, you don't see any significant barriers to going to at least 2028 and potentially 2030 or beyond. Is that right?
That's correct, Senator.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask a question to all the witnesses. What do you think could be the unintended consequences of terminating federal funding for ISS in 2025, 5 years potentially before the end of its usable life? And I'll open that up to anyone.
I don't mind starting. I think we could signal to the science community some uncertainty, and we could see science dry up. I think we could signal to the entrepreneurial community who may need more time, and we could see capital dry up. I think we could, I'll use the term head fake. We could have some people start something, and as we go down this path, they've invested some capital and they find it's not going to work out because we're not certifying the life extension using government dollars. And frankly, I think the transportation costs are a bit of an elephant in the room. Everybody who's able to generate revenue on ISS today is having government-sponsored transportation back and forth, so that's got to be solved.
And I would just add, the entrepreneurial community, the commercial community, when they look at doing research on station, they're not looking at a one-shot deal. They're looking at a research roadmap, especially when we're talking about our pharmaceutical companies that are doing work. We're talking about a 10-year time frame. They do not want to see a trajectory that does not meet their research roadmap. We've already had anecdotal evidence of companies that we're working with to try to get to station hesitate once that 2025 date was announced.
And if we get to 2025 and the only space station in low Earth orbit is being operated by China, is that good for the United States of America?
You know, Congressman, that's exactly what I was going to add to the conversation, is that our biggest concern as well needs to be the international relationships that we've developed all these years, develop the collaboration, look at the relationship that we continue to have today with Russia, even though we know what's going on in the world. This is the one thing that has really pulled us all together, kept us focused and working together. To give that up to China would be devastating, in my opinion.
So I'd like to add, you know, I lived through ISS for many, many years since the beginning. And during that process, I was involved in the decision process from the outside of watching us decide that we would retire shuttle and have commercial crew. And it didn't really turn out the way we had all talked about, which really was you had to bring on a commercial crew provider and then let shuttle retire. And we are seriously suffering the consequences today. That we are relying on another country to get us to orbit, get our crews to orbit and back is a travesty. If we are going to lead, which this country only should be doing, we need to do it by making the right commitments and making sure our transitions are sound. We need to stay in space. We have to be there. That's the high ground. That's where we need to be. And we need to do it with other countries as well. That's critically important for us as well. So to lose the ISS without having some other capability in orbit that is American-made, I think it'd be a huge mistake.
So if I understand your testimony, you're saying before we wind down any platform that history has taught us we need to have a reliable alternative in place first so that we're not left with nothing and a lack of capability and a vulnerability to other nations.
That is of critical importance. Yes, sir.
Mr. Mitchell, you and I are both Houstonians. What impact does the Johnson Space Center have on economic development and jobs in and around Houston? And what would happen if NASA were to prematurely cancel a large program like ISS or to reduce mission control at JSC?
Well, NASA has a tremendous impact from an economic development standpoint. Today, there's currently $1.4 billion in salaries that go through the Johnson Space Center. But more importantly, I need to set up the answer to that question by stating a few facts, and that is that in 2012, the Johnson Space Center had 18,294 employees. Today, we have less than 11,000 employees. Today, currently, there's a little over 4,700 that are working on the International Space Station. I hate to use the same term as I used a few minutes ago, but it would be devastating to the community and to the space program to cut our number of people working for NASA supporting the International Space Station. That would put us down to less than 5,000 people. So it would be devastating to the community.
Okay, thank you. My final question, Ms. Bouthot, is directed to you. Your written testimony highlights that more than 55% of payloads to the National Lab are private sector customers, and that includes projects from iconic Fortune 500 companies and also from innovative startups. Some of the examples of research that have been conducted on the ISS include Goodyear is using microgravity to better understand silica morphology for the manufacturing of new tires with low rolling resistance that are more fuel efficient and safer. Casis Materials states that, quote, research could give Goodyear a competitive advantage in the tire industry by developing superior rubber materials. Likewise, Procter & Gamble is using microgravity to understand complex fluid behavior and to improve the functionality and shelf life of consumer personal care products such as shampoo, shaving cream, and gelatin. Merck is using microgravity to grow a crystalline suspension of millions of tiny uniform crystals to improve the formulation of the company's cancer immunotherapy drug, Keytruda. Keytruda is the drug that helped former President Jimmy Carter's cancer go into remission. And Forbes has reported that some analysts predict that Keytruda may be Merck's next $10 billion drug. Now, Ms. Bouthot, tell me, to what extent do American taxpayers receive direct payments or benefits from the research that's being conducted by Fortune 500 companies that may give them a competitive advantage in their respective industries?
That's an excellent question, and we were just with Paul Reichert, the researcher from Merck, yesterday talking about the Keytruda drug at the BIO conference, and I have to say that Merck is one of the biggest spokes companies and advocates for doing research in space. I would step back and point to the work that we have done to quantify value and impact back to the American taxpayer. We have looked at best practice analogs around what are the economic, the innovation, and the humankind social benefits. Those were the numbers I was quoting around the $900 million of incremental revenue, the $110 billion of total addressable market, the acceleration in time to market. These are some examples of those broader economic impacts that are coming back to the American taxpayer. When you mentioned Goodyear with the tires, not only are there going to be return on investments to Goodyear from tire sales and being a leader in their industry, but those tires are going to result in lower emissions. I've got another, which is a humankind benefit. We've got other examples like Delta Faucet, which is looking at shower heads. And again, their project may result to Delta Faucet in their product, but the point is, how do you make a better water efficient tool that again can look at these broader humankind benefits? So we've done a lot of work looking at best practice analogs to understand how we can best communicate that overall value of economic innovation and humankind benefit back to the country, in addition to what the individual organizations are doing in terms of benefiting from that work on station.
Well, thank you for your testimony. I think that was helpful. If I understood you right, though, you said that there would be benefits to humanity from new technologies, and those are certainly real and cognizable. At the same time, there's not currently a revenue stream coming to the taxpayers if a $10 billion drug is developed on the ISS, that revenue, that profit is not going back to the taxpayers. I know I, and I think other members of this committee, are interested in working with stakeholders and thinking about whether it makes sense for the taxpayers to enjoy some of the upside. We see many of our large research universities that innovate in science and enjoying the upside from the innovations they receive, and I think that has the potential over the long term to help provide additional funding streams for deep space exploration and for continued American leadership in space. So that will be a continued topic of discussion among members of this committee and stakeholders throughout the industry. I will note at this point that I am unfortunately going to a meeting at the White House right now, and so Senator Markey or Senator Nelson has very kindly agreed to chair the remainder of.
I'm going to chair the remainder.
Okay, so one or the other will chair, and I'll let them fight it out as to who gets the gavel. But I appreciate both of their willingness to chair, and I apologize that this conflict arose just a couple of hours ago, and so being unable to be in two places at once.
Mr. Chairman, you might not want me to chair because we might, by the time you got back, already have passed a NASA bill.
I have faith we will continue to work together in a bipartisan manner to get that done. And I want to thank each of the witnesses. I think this hearing has already been productive, and I'm sure there will be continued and very positive discussion going forward. So thank you for being here. And with that, I'll turn it over to Senator Markey.
And I will recognize Ranking Member Senator Nelson.
Just for a quick question here to follow up on the question of products and medicines. I'm curious, do you happen to know what it is about the properties of zero-G that are allowing Keytruda to become more effective, even more so than it already is?
So Merck is actually doing protein crystallization work on station. And what they're doing is they're looking at the ability to deliver the biologic in a less painful way. So it's all about the protein crystallization effects of larger, more formed proteins on station within microgravity. The big sort of end result for Keytruda is right now those biologics are very painful to deliver into the body. They have to be administered in the hospital. And the work that Merck is doing with Keytruda using protein crystallization in microgravity is allowing that biologic to be delivered less painfully into the body, and also let it be delivered in a doctor's office or even the home care setting, which dramatically will reduce the hospital, the healthcare type costs associated with it.
Well, I'm curious to hear more about that. If you want to see the original apparatus on protein crystallization on orbit, I invite you to stop by the office over here at the Hart Building. But what I can't understand is, from what you just said, what it is about zero-G in the growing of crystals in zero-G, which we've been doing now for 32 years, what it is that is making the Keytruda drug less painful, as you indicated. And so I'd just like to follow up with that.
I'm happy to. I will take that offline, and we will bring back information to you, detailed information on that.
I think, and I'll just say this in passing, what I think to save the space station, I mean, we've given all these kinds of reasons of why you want to extend it beyond 2024, but this one is an example of something that the American people can immediately understand. If you are developing products and medicines unique to the properties of zero gravity of orbit, then when the American people see that being developed for application here on the face of the earth, that's going to be pretty dramatic. So keep those examples coming, and in the course of your testimony, if you might give other examples, that would be very good.
Senator, I could give you an example right now.
Please.
Okay. Osteoporosis and low bone mass are estimated to affect 44 million U.S. men and women over the age of 50 every year. A pharmaceutical company named Amgen decided to fly mice on the ISS and study the impacts of certain drugs on the mice's bone mass while in orbit. It was discovered that the drug named osteoprotegrin, OPG, decreased bone resorption and compared to untreated mice. So their first year's sales in 2011 was $554 million. This year, their sales will reach $3.3 billion. So there's another example.
And so what you're saying is, by the properties of zero-G, of which we already know, besides this experiment with mice, we know that that's affecting our astronauts. And that's why they have such a vigorous physical regimen on board the space station. Because when you don't have the effects of gravity, and you don't have that stress on the skeletal structure, then there is a lessening of bone mass. And we've seen this by the annual physicals that are occurring over time, what they call a longitudinal study of astronaut health. So what you're saying is, by growing mice, they see lessened bone mass, and then this drug is directly helping that?
Yes, sir. In fact, there are two drugs that they've created now. It's Prolia and Exgevia. Those are the two drugs that they were able to develop from that experiment on the ISS with the mice.
Okay, Thank you very much.
Thank you. So this hearing, I think, is fascinating to everyone who is watching it because it's talking about this potential to have real benefits that flow to corporations and through corporations to individuals all across our country and all across the world. And that storyline is really the 21st century storyline. You know, people know that Tang was developed because of the original 1960s NASA program. But it's been harder for people to step back and look at the constellation of possibilities, you know, for our country and for the world from the next generation of NASA investment, of space exploration, of the recombinant private sector, public sector DNA combinations that can make a tremendous difference in the future. I know that just on the International Space Station from Massachusetts, we have One Drop Diagnostics US from Boston. We have Guardian Technologies from Boston. We have radiation monitoring devices from Watertown. We have Emulate Incorporated from Cambridge. But as you said, Ms. Bouthot, the public still doesn't grasp that Novartis has a interest in this. That is that it's not just the companies that are providing equipment for the space station who are now interested in it. It's companies who don't provide equipment, who are trying to find ways in which they can use these technologies to improve their ability to create products, create jobs, create wealth in our society. So can you expand upon that a little bit more, what the vision is of the private sector companies?
I think that it's important to note that these examples that we're giving on the demand side are from non-traditional space companies that would not normally think about diverting their research goals to do something in low Earth orbit, even though they are starting to see the benefits. So the more that we have this proof of concept, the more results that we're getting, the more value that we're projecting, the more that we see this demand increasing. But I would just like to mention that yesterday, General Abramson, who is our CASIS interim chief executive officer, and I were at the BIO conference in Boston. And General Abe came up with this idea to give pioneer awards to 4 of the major pharmaceutical companies that we're working with: Merck, Novartis, Lilly, and Amgen. And I actually was very skeptical, saying, you know, we're already working with these companies. Why do we need to give them an award? And as it turned out, it was fabulous. We got senior level real excitement about receiving this Pioneer Award. And I think we have to recognize when we're working with this non-traditional demand that, yes, they may be, you know, producing their own research and benefiting from it. There may be the knock-on benefits to the value and return on investment to the American taxpayer. But these non-traditional space companies are truly pioneers in doing this type of research on station, and we should really acknowledge that and celebrate that. So I just like
to... So you're saying that perhaps not Novartis itself, but companies like Novartis, who now look at the space station, see real potential for research that leads to development of new products, are now looking at a 2024, 2025 cliff, and again, not necessarily Novartis, but companies like that, dozens of them, maybe hundreds of them, if they felt that there was a runway here, start to say, well, with that cliff, why should I take the risk of making the investment now in this new way of looking at the space station, which actually starts to create products back on Earth that create jobs? So what % of these companies would you say are in that category? Is it pervasive across our economy, that companies that historically have been looking at this are now a little bit more hesitant to engage?
I only have anecdotal evidence, but what I would say is this. In every case, when we talk with a commercial company about the research they're doing on station, these are strategic discussions about a broad portfolio of the work they're doing. It's never a one-shot deal. They would not divert resources for that. So they do need to see that runway that matches their development timeline. For drug companies, that development timeline is 10+ years. So we already have anecdotal evidence of companies that we've initiated discussions with about doing research on station. Once they heard that 2025 date, they really started pulling back and questioning.
So you're saying that if a drug company was trying to develop a new line of research, they'd give themselves 10 years
At least.
in order to make the breakthrough. And if all we're going to give them is another 7 years, that makes it more problematic for them in terms of taking tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars and putting it at risk. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, what other industries are like the drug industry that are name industries that are looking at the space station in the future for a dramatic increase in commercialization of products that would be developed up there?
So drug companies within our life science vertical are big. We have 4 big areas that we focus on. The second is physical sciences, which has a whole host of consumer product and industrial type companies doing research.
For example?
Goodyear, we've already talked about Goodyear. They are doing, looking at the morphology of the silica within their tires. NEMAC, it's a Wisconsin-based company looking at lighter, cheaper alloy in the production of engines. So we've got a whole, and we've mentioned Procter & Gamble, where they're looking at shelf life and those types of things. So that's a big area that we're seeing interest. The third is technology. We're seeing technology companies looking at a whole host of project work on station. And then the fourth is the remote sensing area. We gave the example of Honeywell looking at using remote sensing applications to detect oil and gas leaks in parts of the world that, that there's nobody there. So we're seeing a broad interest in all of those 4 categories. And, the research portfolio discussions we have with each and every one of those companies is similar. They're looking at, once they look at this sort of investment in shifting resources, they do not want to see a cliff.
Right. So we have a situation here where NASA is eager to move on to the moon and to Mars, and then to just say to the private sector, here, you take low Earth orbit. Your job to figure this out now and to try to figure out how to commercialize it. Mr. Chilton, do you think that the commercial market will be ready to take on the low Earth orbit missions by 2025?
I think signaling that we have to do it by 2025 or there is no market will become a self-fulfilling prophecy for no market. There has to be an incremental approach. I would add to the previous answer the transportation industry. We've got a Starliner product previously discussed. If I'm not sure that the commercial entity running the station is going to buy resupply in its current form, I've got an uncertain market, and product upgrades and continued advances become problematic. So I think that with the revenue gap of $3.2 billion to about of cost to about $100 million of revenue is probably unlikely to close and come together in 7 years, sir.
And she did mention Goodyear tires, which is in the transportation sector. Okay. So, what are the biggest challenges that the private sector, private space sector faces in terms of taking the helm from NASA? What are those top obstacles that will be hard for them to resolve?
I'll throw out a few and then wait for reaction from my colleagues. We have to remember the space station is a national lab today by law, and those typically don't have to generate revenue. The people who staff that national lab are government employees, highly trained. A new commercial operator's got a very small pool of applicants to staff their lab if they're operating it commercially. Currently, the U.S. Astronaut Corps and some from a few other nations. Other obstacles are that station includes labs from Europe and Japan, and so you have to get the export control and all the policy things right to be able to work with them up there. I think those are all long cycle obstacles, and 7 years will be tough.
Long cycle is, in your mind, not 5 to 7 years. It's longer than that.
With absolute certainty and knowing you could approach policy, 7 years seems like a long time. History suggests, commercial crew and otherwise, that this is a long cycle endeavor. I respectfully offer that the answer to who might not show up in 7 years, how many of them are thinking about it that would quit, it's 100% of those who haven't started. If you're in the pipeline to take something to station commercially today, you may continue. If you're thinking about it but haven't started, now you've got a new consideration.
So it's going to create a chilling effect then on anyone else. There's always other private sector opportunities which any company can look at, but this would be one that, in your opinion, would just be too risky if someone was starting now and thinking about trying to put something together for before that it's completed before 2025.
In my view, the capital you could attract for this, in a complete absence of a government backbone, is not going to be as attractive as other options.
Okay, thank you. So on average, NASA's budget for the space station is $3.4 billion a year. The administration's central argument for its proposal to end direct funding of the space station in the mid-2020s is, quote, to reduce costs. Though funds for the space station could be used for other costly deep space missions, I am skeptical those missions would be successful without the important research carried out on the space station. To all of you, why is it important that the government continue to fund the space station at those levels into the mid-2020s and possibly after? Mr. Suffredini?
Yes, thank you. Well, I don't know if you're asking about the funding in general or just keeping the International Space Station around, but in our view, and similar to the rest of the folks here with me, the idea that the ISS goes away without some other platform being available is not good for a number of reasons, not the least of which is what you've heard here this afternoon. But when you think about, as has been said here, the fact that we have users on board today, many of who, particularly those trying to do manufacturing, if you pick a date and don't have a sound plan, you're going to lose these people, and you'll see the utilization of ISS start to tail off. But most critical, from our way of thinking about it, is you're going to lose the LEO marketplace that is slowly building. So we think the big push for the International Space Station, other than what it does today, starts with what's going on at CASIS, which is bringing commercial entities to the market, particularly right now in research, but also in studying manufacturing options. But then to continue that process, because as you're seeing here today, a lot of these things are on a very long cycle. And so we're just now starting to be able to give evidence of specific cases where it's useful. If we start talking about ending ISS without having another platform available to take over, what's going to happen is we're going to have a big dip, which we may not recover from.
Mr. Mitchell, if you could give us your view on this argument that they're saying we just have to reduce costs, and this just has to go. What's your answer to that?
Well, to me, you can't do it. It's impossible. I like the term backbone. The federal government has to be the backbone of the ISS, even if you do commercialize it. There's no way you can make the business plan, in my opinion, for small commercial companies and/or launch vehicles to support the ISS. So in my opinion, you have to have a backbone to it. You go back and look at this year's budget. To operate the ISS itself is 1.4 is the proposal. The space transportation is 2.5. There's your 3.5 to $4 billion. 2.5 to launch. So who's going to pay for that? To me, there's just not a business plan in a commercial industry to be able to maintain and launch at the same time.
So let me come back to you then, Mr. Suffredini. Yesterday, the Washington Post reported that, quote, NASA is talking to several international companies about forming a consortium that would take over operation of the International Space Station and run it as a commercial space lab. NASA administrator said in an interview. Axiom Space is one of a handful of companies looking at building the commercial successor to ISS. What would happen to Axiom Space if NASA establishes a consortium to operate ISS? Are you concerned that it could have a chilling effect on competition and innovation?
Well, I think those are really two different things. Operating the ISS with a consortium theoretically would continue ISS as we know it till sometime the government decides it won't be spending money on it anymore. I think Jim's been very clear, and we see it the same way. You're not going to make money off the International Space Station as it is today. It is expensive to own and operate. However, new spacecraft built specifically based on later technology, we can build them much less expensive, operating for less costs, and so we actually can make a buck. So the answer to your question is, as long as there is a point at which we will ultimately transition to a fully commercial capability, having a transition period where industry does operate the ISS is certainly viable in our way of thinking.
Ms. Bouthot, NASA carries out vital research on the space station. A platform like the space station addresses 22 out of 33 human health risks identified by NASA for current and future deep space missions, including the effects of a closed spacecraft design and what effect exposure to long-term radiation would have on cancer rates. Could you elaborate on the consequences of this administration's proposal about ISS and what would happen to all of this important research?
I think you've noted life science is a very rich area for research on station, not just for the commercial and entrepreneurial community that are doing it, but also as a proof of concept and a proving ground for a lot of the work that NASA is doing. I think we see the ISS National Lab as this proof of concept that can eventually lead to the moon, to exploration and beyond, but also as being on the cusp of a sustainable manufacturing where some of the things that you've just noted, we eventually could be not just finding proof of concept solutions in the short term, but actually solving them in the longer term.
Okay, so yes, Mr. Chilton.
Senator, I would offer that NASA, when we talk about eliminating cost versus reducing cost, NASA will, I predict NASA will want access to the station in all scenarios. And beyond 2025, they need to address those human health risks. They need to learn more about long-term life support. So NASA and the government will spend money on the station in some model. The desire to reduce that seems reasonable on some time scale, but the idea of just eliminating it at a date certain, less reasonable.
Okay, so let me ask you this. When you say to them it's not reasonable to completely reduce it because there's going to be a need for research for NASA, what do they say to you?
In full disclosure, they've, in good faith, asked for studies and information from industry. We've all submitted those, and we don't have our feedback yet.
You don't have your feedback yet. Okay, so they've given you this opportunity to explain to them how you can't just pull out, that NASA's still going to need a substantial amount of information coming back from the space station in order to help all these already preceding initiatives that NASA has. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, they're giving us a chance to give them full feedback and asking broadly, not just companies like Boeing.
Okay, beautiful. Okay, here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to give each one of you 1 minute to summarize what you want the subcommittee, the full committee, to remember as we're moving forward here. And again, understanding that Senator Cruz and I agree. Senator Nelson and I agree with Senator Cruz on these issues in terms of the sequencing that should, in fact, take place. So that's no small moment in the history of this committee. So congratulations on creating a consensus here, because it definitely helps to increase dramatically our likely success or effectiveness in getting the right answer here. So I'm going to give each one of you 1 minute to tell us what you want the committee to remember about your testimony and about the future of NASA and the space station. Mr. Suffredini.
Well, first I'd say we feel strongly that the United States should not allow a gap of access to LEO and a platform on which to operate. We would like to see the government and the agency work towards supporting commercial being able to be in a position at some point to take over for the International Space Station. And to that end, we'd like to see port solicitation be put in place immediately, and that any money additional that NASA has given for commercial development be spent on helping develop demand.
Yeah, excellent. Mr. Mitchell.
Turn it off. Thank you. What I'd like to say is to go back to what I said a little bit earlier, and that's for us to understand the importance of our leadership, America's leadership in space, and to look at what China, what Russia, what are other countries trying to accomplish to get ahead of us on that. And the fact that, again, go back to China, China just, recently last week asked our international partners to work with them on their ISS or their space station, is something that we should be concerned about. To me, it's a national security issue, it's global leadership, and that's where our focus should be. Not to mention that we have to have this as a test bed for us to go on to Moon and Mars and beyond. But first and foremost, in my mind, we have to maintain our leadership in space.
Yeah, beautiful. Mr. Chilton.
First, I would say a strong recommendation that you consider a criteria versus time-based way to reduce cost. Mm-hmm. Just let the facts and data and the markets emerge as they do on the time they naturally do versus say it must be a certain time. That's first. Second, as you do that, avoid uncertainty for the research and science communities. We need to keep that pipeline full, and we need to signal to them that we're deliberatively working through this, and that lab will be there. Mm-hmm. And the third thing I would ask you to do is remember those high school students who spend every day of their life with humans living and working aloft. I'll call them Generation ISS. Let's not have them talking in 10 or 15 years saying, in my day, we had people in space living continuously. Let's just keep it that way.
Thank you, Mr. Chilton. Ms. Bouthot.
I'll go back to the demand, and we believe demand is the underpinning for building a sustainable LEO marketplace. We believe that it is also the trajectory to eventual manufacturing in space, and when we can do that, we will truly have a viable market that can support supply as well as the non-traditional demand. We would hope that we continue to receive support around generating this demand and looking at the capabilities that these new users need. We're working very closely with NASA now on identifying what those enabling capabilities are, so understanding what can best meet the needs of these new users and protecting them, and also really celebrating these new users because they are pioneers in the creation of this new marketplace.
Okay, beautiful. Well, this was excellent hearing, excellent set of witnesses. We thank you. And again, we're trying to work as closely as we can together in order to come up with a common perspective that we can advocate for on a bipartisan basis in order to ensure that we get the right result here. The hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks. During this time, senators are asked to submit any questions for the record to our witnesses, and upon receipt, the witnesses are requested to submit their written answers to the committee as soon as possible. The committee thanks the witnesses for appearing today, and with that, he took the gavel with him. No. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.